what the consequences are of losing different strategies, what sort of information is available on different levels of the speech signal, and sort of in order to better understand basically how we make meaning, depending on who we are, what the listening situation is that we are listening in. And so we're going to be looking at speech perception in 4 different domains or 4 different ways. The first is basically how different cognitive abilities are connected to listening in some listening situation. And the main point basically I want you to take away from that is that cognition is not a unified concept, and that we need to be a little bit more sophisticated, thinking about different cognitive abilities in the context of different listening situations. So we spent a little bit of time on that. Then just talking about that there are very different listening strategies that people can using, and sometimes not everyone has access to all the cues, and that may shape what sort of listening strategies they are using. The thing is that may have consequences and come at a cost. So in the third part, we are going to look at how the choice of listening strategies can affect subsequent aspects of communication, such as integrating and remembering heard information, formulating response, and producing a response. And then the last little bit, we just spent a little bit of time on another consequence of listening strategies, and that's listening effort, how we can measure that, how we can manipulate that. So hopefully, you know, there's something in it for everyone who is listening. And I know, you know, just to sort of set the scene, so complex listening is not a very, you know, well-defined sort of concept. So complex listening situations, there are very many, and different people may think of different listening situations when we are thinking of complex listening situations. So sort of having a lot of background noise may be one way. Trying to have a conversation one-to-one while somebody is talking in the background, so you have a distractor signal, is another complex listening situation. And then, of course, the very classic one, you know, where you have a family dinner or a family function, or you're sitting in a restaurant and there's just lots of noise and you're trying to desperately hang on to what people are saying. So these are all 3 different listening situations that are all complex, but they are complex in different ways. And successful listening may be achieved in very different ways for each of these listening situations. So maybe the first thing that would be quite useful to do is to sort of think about how, in what way can listening situations be complex? Is there a way in which we can sort of quantify or parameterize this and think about this in, you know, sort of systematic ways? And so one quite obvious way is that we could think about the speech signal, and we can think about the task-masker type, and basically recognize or acknowledge that it's quite different whether your speech target is a phoneme or syllable, whether it's a word, whether it's a sentence, whether it's sort of connected speech, maybe longer speech. And that is quite different in the sense that, you know, these things differ in lexical complexity and grammatical complexity, just overall linguistic complexity, give different cues and probably are perceived very differently. Similarly with masker type, you can think about, you know, go from sort of very simple unmodulated, maybe white or pink noise, to modulated noise, to multi-talker babble, to maybe 1 or 2 background talker babble. And these things are fundamentally, they're very different things, and the way that listeners deal with this is very differently. And they are also on a continuum of increased sort of information masking and potentially increased complexity. So you could be sort of go in within this sort of matrix, think about, you know, whether a listening situation is maybe more like simpler, more simple by using phonemes or syllables and like an unmodulated noise, and then it gets more and more complex if you have like a more complex foreground signal and a more complex background noise. So all of these are basically speech and noise situations, but they're from the characteristic, they're very different in terms of characteristic. So this will become important in just a minute, as you will see. So the thing is, cognitive abilities, how are they related to speech and noise perception? So what we did was PhD student of mine a few years ago. Basically, we made him collect all of the speech and noise perception papers that measured speech and noise perception and one cognitive ability in order to see what strengths of predictive strength, essentially, they found between the cognitive ability and the speech and noise perception task. And if you do look at it, then you see that there's actually quite a range in predictive effect or in effect sizes that goes from almost zero, like as in nothing, to 0.6, 0.7, which is really quite strong. And so the question is, like, can we understand where that variability comes from and sort of, make sense of it a bit more? So in order to make sense of it, we looked at it in two different ways. The first thing is that we said, okay, cognition is not a unified concept, and you really should be looking at separate cognitive functions. If, again, you look into the literature, then there are certain that keep coming up as being measured in connection with speech, such as inhibitory control, updating working memory, set shifting, intelligence, episodic memory, processing speech and attention. So can we, basically the question then was, looking at all of our papers that we put out of the literature, can we classify the papers according to which cognitive function they measured? And does that tell us something about the association strength between them? So here are the 5 cognitive domains that we looked at in the speech and noise perception papers. And when we do that, and you look at the sort of the big sort of, this is the pooled effect size for each of the cognitive domains. And so you can see that it basically goes from about an effect size of 0.2, which actually crosses over to 0. So it's not entirely clear that this is a true effect size. So 0.2, it keeps sort of, going up. 0.3, this is also 0.3, all the way to about 0.4. So the effect size, if we are looking at the effect size or the basically predictive effect of processing speech for speech and noise perception, is twice as high as if we are measuring crystallized intelligence as our cognitive domain. So it actually makes a difference what sort of cognitive function you measure in association with speech and noise perception. So I think that's the first thing to take away from this. The other thing I want you to take away from this plot is, so basically you can see all the different papers that go into each of these functions, and you can see that clearly working memory has a lot more than any of the other cognitive domains. And I think that just reflects the fact that working memory really has been sort of a favorite cognitive domain to be investigated in connection with speech and noise perception for a very long time. You just have to have, so you just have a lot more papers. Yeah.
We've got a quick question from Trevor. He says, could you just explain each of the cognitive domains?
Yes.
For us?
So crystallized intelligence basically is knowledge about the world, such as vocabulary, such as general knowledge. It's about so a lot of, if you look at aging, then a lot of performance and a lot of cognitive domain goes down with age. Crystallized intelligence is the one thing that gets better with age. So, you keep learning about the world, you keep expanding your vocabulary store. And so there's a lot of thought about maybe older adults should be using this in order to, or maybe they are using this in order to understand about the world when perceptual sort of abilities are sort of going, getting worse. Episodic memory is basically just your long-term memory. I'm going to talk about this a bit later more, but it's basically you're hearing a piece of information and you can retrieve it from memory half an hour later, 2 weeks later, your classic your classic memory essentially. Inhibitory control is about purposefully disregarding information. So if you have a very crowded visual scene, for instance, and you are asked to pay attention to one bit and to disregard everything else, which in some of the inhibitory control tasks purposefully sort of gives contradictory information. So you can basically measure how much harder people feel it to concentrate on one thing when you're giving contradictory information sort of, in other domains, and they're meant to be completely ignoring it. Sometimes that's really hard. And how well you can do that, it basically defines how good your inhibitory control is. Working memory is keeping things in mind while you're doing something to them. So, that's your, classic mental arithmetic task. And processing speed often is quite, they can be sort of quite simple tasks where you're just measuring reaction time, like how fast can you do things. And like, as I said, as you get older, except for crystallized intelligence, all of the others tend to go down. There's also the reason, I think, so there's a lot of research on the cognitive domains. Like they are associated with different brain regions and different brain, like this is not only philosophical sort of distinctions, but there are physiological sort of correlates for each of these domains. So this is like really quite well established and quite well agreed that these are different domains and they work quite differently. Okay, so are there any other questions?
No, not yet.
Okay. Okay, so because working memory has so many more papers than any of the others, we're going to go into a little bit more detail because it basically allows us to sort of dig a bit deeper to sort of understand what the patterns are. And that the next thing we're going to look at is, okay, we haven't done anything with classifying speech and noise situations at all. And we talked about that you might be able to classify them according to what the foreground signal is, what the background signal is. Does that make a difference in the association with working memory? So the first thing we're going to do is to look at any foreground task, but we're going to split up the papers according to whether the speech is presented in unmodulated noise, modulated noise, and babble noise, and just see whether that changes the association strength with working memory, or the predictive ability of working memory, essentially. And what you can see is that the effect size basically increases the more complex the background signal is. So going from a modulated noise to modulated to babble noise, you basically, again, almost double the effect size of how predictive working memory is for speech and noise perception. So essentially, if you're doing a speech and noise task, syllables and unmodulated noise, it really doesn't matter how your working memory is and whether it's good or bad. It has no predictive effect. However, if you're doing a sentence task in babble noise, for instance, then it does make a difference. And people who tend to have better working memory tend to do better on the speech and noise, speech and babble task, essentially. And that's essentially what the next slide is showing. So this is sort of the most granular plot we have, where we're looking at the association strengths of working memory for sentences in babble noise. So that's a fairly complex foreground signal, sentences as opposed to syllables or words. So it's has more potential information in it. And babble noise is more complex than unmodulated or modulated noise. And in this case, you have a predictive strength or an effect size of 0.4 or more, which is actually not bad for speech. So for sort of, these types of experiments, you would be very happy to find that in your experiments. And it basically means, like, you can expect, if you look at the here, like, this doesn't include 0. So whichever experiment you do, you should be able to expect that you will find a significant correlation or association strength. So thinking a bit more about exactly what is your speech situation, what's your foreground signal, what's your background signal, what sort of cognitive aspects you want to measure, I think can really make a big difference in your experimental design and find different associations, and can sort of help you understand why, when you're sometimes sitting in a talk and people say, oh, we didn't find anything, like, cognition is not involved. And then you can say, yeah, so what was the speech noise situation you were using? What was the cognition that you were measuring? And then, it just helps you sort of to understand a little bit better where all of this variability comes from. So that's sort of the first thing, the first sort of point I wanted to get across. The second point I want to talk about is that actually not everyone uses the same strategies, and not everyone may be using cognition or, like certain cues to the same effect. And I think it's really important to sort of understand what cues are different people using. And again, be aware that, we are setting up the experiments in a way that, sort of draws this out to the sort of most extreme level so we can measure it. These are all effects that do exist in the real world, but they're really hard to measure in the real world. So that's why we do like these really finicky experiments. And this is acoustic phonetics experiment. So let's see if I can walk you through this. So this is essentially not about cognition at all, at least not in this at the start. So this is about the acoustic information that's available in the speech signal. And you would sort of think that the most efficient way of listening is to sort of try to use as much information that is available in the signal as possible, rather than filling it in, or what other strategies you can use. The problem is that this phonetic acoustic information in the speech signal is language specific, which begs the question, essentially, can everyone use that? Do you need to get used, do you need to learn about it in order to use it? Like, how accessible is that information? And just in case you don't know about form and frequencies, just very quickly. So you have the 5 cardinal formants, cardinal vowels in English, i.e. A, O, U. And the way in which they're specified in the speech signal is that they have basically energy peaks at different frequencies. And depending on, what the pattern of energy peaks is, which are called formants, that sort of combines to a particular vowel. So as a listener, whenever you hear that distribution of energy, you will hear that as an I or an E or an A. And that is, part of you learning a language. So that means that when you are reading, when you're hearing something, it's basically a word is a different distribution of energy across the frequency spectrum. Now, interestingly, the vowel formants do not only carry energy about the characteristic of the vowel, like which vowel it is. It also carries information about consonants. And it not only carries information right about the speech that is being pronounced at this particular time, but it can also carry information about speech that is either upcoming or has been pronounced. So, sort of the spread of information is quite wide. And the question is, can listeners use that? Can they use these sort of really subtle cues in order to predict, for instance, what is upcoming? So in order to sort of show you how that works, we had people say basically different target words in connection with a carrier sentence. And the carrier sentence was always the same. The target word only differed in one phoneme, which is an L or an R. The reason why we're using an L and an R is because they are acoustically very similar, and they only differ in the third formant. So that's the only thing. So if you're measuring load and rate, sort of, as on the spectrogram, you will see that both of these words look very similar, but the third formant in rate is slightly lower than in load. And this is how you, how you recognize these sort of words. What we wanted to know is this information between load and road and the difference, is that already available much earlier? Can you see that in vowels that are before, that come before the load and the road? So is that sort of some sort of foreshadowing where vowels that come before the target words already carry some of this information? So basically we have the target phrase, and so there are a couple of vowels here. So the I from it, the I from might, and then the E from be. So do these vowels look different if they're spoken in the context of an L word or an R word? And so if you look at this, and you look at this, whoops, if you look at this, hang on, can I, what's my, let me see. No, was it there?
Yeah, there is.
Oh, there it is. Okay. So, and we're going to look at 3 formants separately, the second formant, the third, and the fourth. If you look at the, and also, in one case, it's an unstressed syllables, and the other one, it's a stressed one. I'm going to tell you right now. So that's basically just how you pronounce the words. And I'm just going to tell you right away, unstressed syllables are much better to see these effects than stressed effects. So we're going to concentrate on the left column, essentially. Right. So for a second formant, if you sort of you look at the second formant frequency of I from it, E of be, and I of might, and you're looking at the difference between L and R when they're spoken in the context of an L word or an R word, and you can see there's not much of a difference. It's very close to 0. So it doesn't look any different. Now, if you're looking at the third frequency, then you can see that in might in particular, so this is L minus R, so that means on average, the same might, the same I, the third formant, is about 20 hertz higher when it's spoken in the context of an L word, like load, leave, tiling, filing, than when you speak, or when you say the same phoneme in the context of road, reef, tiring, and firing. So, and you also see that in the fourth frequencies as well. The problem is like the fourth formant is much softer, so it's much harder to hear. So that's why the third formant is sort of, it's a bit compromised between seeing the effect and also having something that's actually still perceptible. But here you can see it in the third formant, that there's a clear difference here, for instance, between in the same word between formant 3 when it's spoken either in the context of an L or an R word. So the next question is, okay, so we can measure that. Does that have any consequences for perception? Can people, pick that up? And so we recorded sentences basically with the L and the R word. So we heard that some of the lighters have been photos, or some of the writers had been forward. So that's basically minimal differences, sentences that only differ in one context. However, if they're spoken by a native English speaker, you would expect that the preceding vowels show that effect, and are slightly lower in the third formant if they're spoken in the writer's sentence compared to the lighter sentence. So that sort of acoustic information is available in the sentence. Does that make sense?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah,
sorry.
Absolutely.
This is obviously not spontaneous speech.
No.
Like it's written down and they see it and then they say it.
Yeah.
Does that make a difference? If you sort of
It's really,
yes,
that's right. We've tried, so it's really hard to know. So we've played around with this a lot, both in terms of what style of speaking should we be using? Should we be using really casual speech or careful speech? Like how prescriptive should we be in the sentences that we're using? The problem is, in order to see this effect sort of play out, like measure it, you need to have, these minimal sentences that are by definition not very natural, but it's like an effect that exists in language. It's just very hard to see in language because there are lots of other things going on as well.
Everything.
Yeah, exactly. And we need to control everything in order to see this. And it's a really, acoustic is quite a subtle effect that has, you know, surprisingly big perceptual consequences. So we're going to come to that. So basically, so we're using these minimal different sentences and sort of record them in all of the, you know, different options. And then what we do is we basically take out the target word because you know, that's because what we want to know is like how well can they predict what the target word is. And we put in either basically a different instance of the same correct target word, like here. So an L word in the you know, when the sentence base was spoken in the context of of this L word, and an R word when it was spoken in the tensor base was spoken in the context of an R word, or we switch them around and see whether people pick up that it's being switched around. Okay, does that make sense so far? Yeah, good. Okay, so these are basically the conditions where you have the correct sentence base paired with the correct target word, correct sentence base, correct target word, and then where you switch it. You see whether that makes any difference. The other thing that is sort of important is we have two different types of words. One where the critical phoneme is at the start and one where it's in the middle. And that's important because when we do the splicing where we sort of cut out the words, if it's a target onset, the critical phoneme, it doesn't matter. Like, we've tried to be so careful, and you really can't hear anything in quiet. Yet, as soon as you splice, there's always a little bit of acoustic disturbance that you just can't get rid of. So in that sense, it's probably much easier to see the effect on word medial simply because you have like an undisturbed syllable before. Okay, so here are the results. What I want you to see is, first of all, so these are all R words, and you can see that having the R words particularly word medially always you know, makes a big difference. So having, you know, if you go back, so this is basically the dairy, and it's the dairy in the context of the correct base, or also in the context of the incorrect base. But basically having the dairy, the R, in the middle of the word is really useful because you have the you have sort of the local R resonances, and they're very helpful in helping you hear the word. So in this case, also you don't need actually the long-term resonances. You're just as good with the wrong one as long as you have the local R resonances in the syllable before. However, the other thing that's really interesting is if you look at the L word, then perception gets worse if you pair it with the wrong base. So that's basically the base that was spoken in the context of an R word. So it does contain these R resonances. So the listener would have expected an R word, and it didn't come. And so that sort of throws them off and, you know, reduces intelligibility, essentially perceptual accuracy, by about 10%. So people do get thrown off because they're using the cue, and if it misleads them, then that's not very helpful. Okay, so yeah, so local R resonances are important, and incorrect long-term R resonances can sort of lower perception. Okay, so this is what happens with native speakers. So now the next question is, do L2 speakers do the same thing? Particularly when they don't have that particular cue. So we tested German speakers, and the reason why they had to come from like one homogeneous group is because we needed to know how that particular cue worked in the native language. And we used German speakers in Cambridge. I mean, you know, so they had all been immersed in English between actually up to 10 years, but with an average of either 1 year or 5 years. Their vocabulary was absolutely amazing. They could function absolutely fine in English, but they had all learned English in German-speaking environments. presumably that cue wasn't available when they were learning English and has only been available since they were immersed in the language, like for either 1 year or 5 years. So the question is, can they pick up the cue? So just very quickly, we again just measured whether this cue exists in German with minimal pairs, and then basically doing the same thing, looking at preceding phonemes, looking at the second and the third format, and see could we see a difference. And actually there wasn't a systematic difference. So basically it's not a cue that's available in German. Okay, looking back at our English speakers, now we have the two German groups. And so the German groups are split up according to how long they have been immersed in English. So how long they have been sort of immersed into using this cues, have been in contact with this cue. And we have people that have been in England for a shorter period of time and then a longer period of time. Now, the one thing I want you to notice for the people who have been immersed for a longer period of time is that having, you know, sort of having short-term cues really sort of helped, particularly in connection with these correct R resonances. So they did show an effect of R resonances. However, and the long stay Germans did not. However, why I would very much caution against that they actually knew what the cue was, because in some other instances they used totally wrong cue. And that is that they were very good at getting L words correct. And they were getting L words correct, particularly when the L was at the start of the word, and it really didn't matter if it was paired with the correct or the incorrect base. We think what this means is that, because as I was saying, whenever you're splicing, you have a little bit of acoustic splatter, and in German, the L is much more lateral, so you do get a lot more acoustic sort of disturbance when producing an L. So they were misinterpreting the splatter that came from the splicing and said, definitely an L word. And so they were basically hanging on to a German cue to recognize the L words. If you now look at the long stay Germans, there's one thing I would say, which is they don't show any effect at all. So they've basically given up on all acoustic cues, correct one, incorrect one. They're just, you know, they have been here long enough to sort of realize that their German cues don't work, but they are not quite picking up the English ones either. So they have completely given up on that sort of cue. The question is, what are they doing in order to boost their perception? So we looked at word frequency, like do they maybe use some statistical cues that they have learned in their use of English? And if you look at this, then you can see that essentially the long stay Germans who know very well how the English language you know, works and like which words are more frequent than others, they're using these cues in order to say, in all likelihood, that was that word, even though I didn't hear it very clearly and I can't use the acoustic cues. I'm using a different, you know, some different information. And it's a cue that probably the Germans who had been here for a shorter period of time didn't have access to, because they didn't have enough exposure to English to have a very clear sense of word frequencies. Whereas if they had been here for 10 years, they knew they had sort of a sense of word frequency better and they could use that cue. So they basically did exactly the same task to a similar level of overall accuracy, but using a very different strategy. So the English native speakers used the acoustic cues in the way that we thought they would, whereas the recently immersed L2 speakers used some correct cues and some incorrect cues and didn't quite, hadn't quite sorted that for them, whereas the long-term L2 speakers completely changed their listening strategy. Okay, so the question is, what listening strategy you're using, does that have any consequences for, subsequent processes? And maybe, you know, one way to be thinking about, you know, subsequent consequences is to use a really, like, I'm not now talking about really old cognitive models, but the thing is, I kind of feel like, you know, cognitive science sort of got this right about 50 years ago. And I think we would do well, sort of, you know, including that in our thinking, because I think there are some very fundamental things that are actually really quite helpful to think about. So one of these old models that I think are quite helpful is Kahneman's attention model. And basically the main point of this model is that you have a limited amount of capacity, attention, energy, doesn't matter, whatever you want to call it. And there's just one pool of sort of cognitive energy available, and you have to think about how are you allocating this? You know, what are you using this on? Also, it's limited. So if you're using it on one thing, you can't be using it on another thing. So that's sort of important to know. The second thing, just to come back to Trevor's question about what is episodic memory, or, you know, just a little bit more to basically a sort of very classic model is this one here. And the idea is that you get your stimulus, like, I don't know, word list. It goes into primary memory where you keep rehearsing it, and that costs energy essentially. And if you can spend this energy and keep rehearsing it, then eventually some of it will be transferred into long-term memory, and you can recall it from secondary memory, even though you're not rehearsing it anymore, because it has sort of in a more permanent storage. And some of it, you know, if you can't spend the energy, you will just forget it. So that's the difference between words in primary memory and secondary memory. Okay, so you could sort of take a list of word pairs, for instance, and you could say that if you're hearing one word pair at a time, you need to keep rehearsing it, and then either you forget it or you transfer it into secondary memory. For the last two word pairs on the list, you're still sort of in this primary memory rehearsing stage. And so you don't need to transfer it to secondary memory for it to be available for recall if you have your recall right afterwards. So, and you can basically measure it by presenting this list of word pairs. So you know which one need to be in which type of memory in order to be retainable. And then you can prompt independently each of these word pairs and sort of get a measurement for how well people remember words, you know, either in the first position, second position, third position, fourth or fifth position. And you know that, you know, like the fourth and the fifth are probably come from primary memory, and the first three need to come from secondary memory if they come. Okay, so we did this. And so we used these sort of lists of word pairs and tested younger and older listeners. And the reason why this was interesting is because we can, you know, going back to Kahneman's model, basically say we are presenting the word lists in noise, and we can measure how much of the energy is taken up by listening to the words in noise, and how much is then available to still do the repetition and the rehearsing in order to transfer lists to primary or secondary memory. So it's sort of like an independent measure of how much energy is spent listening. And so, you know, you can do that with all kinds of memory, all kinds of babble patterns, you know, with continuous babble, or babble that basically just covers the word pair, or babble that covers a little bit more than the word pair, and just see how does that affect memory, essentially as an outcome measure of listening. Yeah. Does that still make sense?
Sorry, yeah. It's just the door outside.
Right.
We've lost all our attention to that.
Exactly. I could see that. Okay, but that makes sense so far. Yep. Okay. Okay. So if we look at the results, so we have our word pair 1 to 5 here. And we know that word pairs 4 and 5 come from primary memory, and word pairs 1 to 3 come from secondary memory. If we look at young people first, then you can see that the fifth word pair clearly is remembered much better, whereas the other word pairs sort of, less well in quiet. And then there's another sort of drop for word pair 1. That's the one that sort of was presented first and really needs to go to secondary memory to, be remembered. You can also see that this is all in quiet. So for old people, they do just as well with the last word pair. And then they have an additional drop for particularly for word pairs 1 to 3, which we know comes from secondary memory. Yep.
Sorry, that's another question. How do you know that it's just the last two that the working memory and not like the last one, say?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That is sort of convention, as in like given the timing of how they were presented and when the feedback, normally it's at like up to 30 seconds is primary, is working memory essentially, and everything below, anything longer is secondary memory. But I kind of feel like we don't have an independent measure of this.
Okay.
Like this is because the cognitive psychologist who was on our team said this is what it was. But I mean, I think from
like
the
4 and 1.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's more, I think it's less about the specific pairs. It's more about the sort of pattern that we see. And the pattern is very different, whether you're talking about the last pairs on a list or the first pairs of the list. And there's no question that the first pairs on the list.
So it's just, you can see like a clear divide.
Yeah, exactly. You can see clear divide. Exactly. And you can see that, for the old adults, particularly for the first 3, which sort of would accord with that secondary memory, their pool of resources is probably smaller. So there's like less that they can spend on transferring this. Okay. So this is in quiet, ideal listening. Now we're adding noise. And the noise, just to say, is they can still hear all the words perfectly. So it's not about them not being able to hear the words. It's just about them having to work a little bit harder to hear the words. And when we do that, what we can see is if we are looking at this, so this is old adults and quiet again. And then the squares are young adults and noise. And basically the noise, even though they can hear all the words, makes the young adults look like the old adults. And that's because I think part of the energy they would have had before in order to encode the words now goes towards understanding the words in the noise. So they're spending some of that energy there, can't spend it on rehearsal. And that sort of makes them look similar to the old adults who have a smaller pool of resources anyway to do the memory. And the old adults you can just see are just uniformly worse because there's a smaller pool. So they are being basically penalized in their memory performance by the noise, even though the noise itself actually is on a lower level because we equate it for perception. So young and old adults are hearing exactly the same amount of words, which is about 95%. So they really can hear it, but it's just hard. The other thing I just very quickly want to point out is that this one is for continuous noise. And then, as I said, we can start playing around with different types of noise and whether it's continuous, discontinuous, how discontinuous, and can use the memory performance as a way to measure what's happening with the noise and how hard it is to listen in the noise. And for instance, what you can see is like for the young adults here, you have the words in quiet. And then you have the words when the noise is only present exactly when the word's present is. And that makes absolutely no difference whatsoever in terms of their memory performance. And we think that that is because what's really hard about the noise is that the noise is continuous. And it's the continuity of having to sort of, stream segregate it. And when you have a continuous noise that sort of encourages stream segregation, which is a good thing for perception, but is also quite takes up a lot of energy. Whereas when you have discontinuous noise that's really only present when the words are present, it doesn't lend itself to stream segregation. So your perception gets worse, but the listening itself is easier because you're never at the point where you can set up your template to actually do proper stream segregation, which would be effortful, but you can't do that. So that's why the memory actually goes up, but perception would go down. So I just basically wanted to make the point that listening can be hard, and that can have consequences further down the stream, essentially, in understanding or remembering words. But the last thing very quickly I want to talk about is that we know that, all of these listening strategies sort of come at a cost. And one way in which we can measure the cost that they come from is memory. Another one is just listening, measuring listening effort. So I just very quickly want to show you a listening effort experiment that we did. And listening effort, is the mental effort that's required to achieve success in listening. It's actually there's more and more work basically showing that if you are living or having to expend a lot of effort all the time, that's really not very good for your mental health and for your, social well-being. There is more and more sophisticated ways in which we are thinking of listening effort. So, for instance, it's not necessarily the more effort you expand, the better listening is. There's lots of things that affect how much effort you're willing to expend that have to do with motivation. And that motivation can come from lots of different things. So it can come from financial reward, where we tell people, if you do well, you get some money. Or it can come from a validative threat, where we're saying, well, you're being tested, you better try hard. Or it can come from it's sort of the way in which the self-perception. So, we play to, well, as a musician, you do great at this task. This actually also works scarily the other way around. So if you just tell old adults long enough, they are old, they're not expected to do well, they won't do well. And I wonder whether that's exactly the same sort of, there's a lot in perceived confidence that makes competence and confidence, actually, that makes a huge difference for listening. That has nothing to do with cognition, has nothing to do with perception. And that I don't think we take into account enough. Okay, and then there's a little bit of work on extraversion neuroticism, but again, this is a systematic review that one of our PhD students did. And so again, you can look at the effect sizes. That's the same measure that we looked at before for the association strength with cognition. And you sort of see, similar numbers with 0.4, 0.6, 0.2, that's sort of in the similar ballpark what we saw before, except it's a completely different, sort of aspect we're looking at the moment. Okay, so for this task, we're going to use financial reward. So basically tell people you're doing a task. If you do well, you get a little bit of money that sort of adds up over time. Or if you're not doing well, we're taking some money away. So, just to make it really hard. We are measuring listening effort in lots of different ways. So you can measure it subjectively, behaviorally, physiologically, and we're going to do all of this. And we're going to use a task that's a tone vocoded sentences, and we are presenting the same tone vocoded sentence twice. And the idea is that when we are measuring perception, it's always a 2-channel tone vocoded, which is hard, 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 except we give people sort of an initial try to sort of make sense of the sentence. And we're giving them 2 different conditions. One is where they get 3 bands, and one where only get 2 channels sort of tone vocoding, which means with the 3 bands, it's actually not too bad. If you're hearing it with 3 bands, you're much more likely to get the 2-channel sort of sentence in the second go than when you're hearing it with 2 channels and 2 channels. So at this point, it's always acoustically exactly the same sentences, but they have either been primed more or less, which makes the listening situation harder if it's 2-channel, then it's slightly easier if it's 3-channel, 2-channel. Does that make sense? Okay, and so they're doing the listening task. So that's the behavioral. They have to say, what did you hear? They have to, sort of state subjectively say, how hard did you find it? And then we are also measuring their pupillometry. Okay, and basically you find all of the effects that you would expect to find. So if we first look at the listening sort of situation, so this is the moderate is like the 3-band followed by the 2-band, and the high is the 2-band followed by the 2-band, and correct response is way harder for the 2 followed by the 2, and where it's much easier for the 3 followed by the 2, even though all of the sentences were exactly the same with the 2-band that we actually measured. Again, also reaction times much higher for the harder ones, and people said it was much higher. So that's all not very surprising. The other thing that's really interesting is besides sort of the listening effects of the listening situation that you can see here, you can also see an effect of motivation. So that is basically like how much money are they potentially able to earn with each trial if they are correct. And so in RT, if they can earn more money, then they are responding more slowly, more carefully, maybe looking extra hard at the words. And they also say it is harder. Who knows if that's true, but so you can see an effect of motivation essentially on the results. Now, if we look at the pupil response, you see exactly the same thing. Like first of all, you see an effect of listening situation. So whether it's 3 followed by 2 or 2 followed by 2, and actually the cue is they're trying harder. So there's like more dilated pupil for the medium, for the moderate difficulty than the high difficulty, probably because they're actually also doing better. So they are, they're trying, this is much more likely to be successful essentially than this one. But again, our motivational task sort of makes a difference, and makes a difference not only in the self-report, but you can also see that in the pupil response. So it's probably, reflecting something effort related. So both higher listening demands and increased motivation lead to more listening effort being expended. Interestingly, the different measures of listening effort did not correlate, and that's actually a field of a lot of research at the moment to sort of try to understand, if we're using different tasks to measure listening effort, are we actually assessing the same thing? Are we assessing different parts of the system? How do we know which part of the system we are assessing? So I think this is really quite interesting to look at in more detail. And again, as we have seen with the memory task already, so expending more listening effort may have consequences for subsequent processing. Okay, that's the end. So just to basically summarize that the same perceptual accuracy can be a result of very different listening strategies, and how we listen very much depends on the listening situation, who we are as a listener, how much energy we have at our disposal, how much we know about the language, how much effort we are willing to expend. But there are some things that probably are more general, such as in more complex listening situations, probably require more cognition. You just have to know what aspect of cognition you want to measure. Older listeners spend more cognitive resources on listening. They have more. They use more semantic context simply because they have a better crystallized intelligence. Working memory is important, and may also be important. I didn't talk about this at all for listening with hearing loss and with hearing aids, which is a completely different topic that we can get into. That's it.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Antje, for that fascinating topic. I have like 500 questions, but I'll keep them for later. We have one question from Duncan online, so I'll read this out. He says, thank you very much. In the vocoder case, would you say the 3-band is acting as a kind of priming for the 2-band?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Any questions, Bill?
So is all this stuff with adults?
Yeah.
And if so, I mean, I realise this is a very broad question, but what would be the difference with children?
Oh, very good, very good. Actually, so I've just been involved in a project with school-aged children. So but this is about listening difficulty, but it's essentially about trying to understand what the listening difficulties come from and how much of that is perceptual difficulties, how much of that is language delay or whatever. And so I think some of the children don't have access, I think, to some of the cues, which essentially also means I think that the listening strategies sort of change over your lifetime. And I've not tested this at all, but I wonder whether the people who are the best listeners are those that are most adept at changing their listening strategies. And I also wonder whether, that's another thing that I really do want to look into is like what happens with hearing loss. And when, for instance, you don't have access to that, like for third form and cue anymore, can you consciously stop using that? Or do you hang on to it even though it's not useful anymore?
I feel like I'm doing that personally. Yeah, my age-related and noise-induced hearing loss is such that speech on speech is really difficult.
Yes, exactly.
And so if I'm trying hard to listen, it kind of feels like I'm hunting for.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's really interesting because I think that is where all of this sort of connects to training. Can we sort of, get a profile for listeners? So what cues are you normally using? Are they sort of adequate for, the situation and your listening situation, And is there like any way we can help you use more efficient cues, which, we know that these cues are efficient in these situations sort of thing. I mean, we don't know any of this, but I really wonder whether we could do some of that work.
I was wondering if there's a bit of an element of luck involved as well. Like you might happen to have just picked, like if people just pick different listening strategies anyway, you might just happen to be lucky and pick one that is more resistant to age-related changes. I agree. And then when you get older and your hearing gets worse, you're kind of okay anyway because you can still do it. I agree. Some people, exactly. And I agree. But then can we help the other people who didn't happen to pick that? They might have just picked a different one. Yeah, but can we help them? Have to do something else. I don't know. Can we help them? Is that open to training? Yeah. Sorry. David Waddington's got a question as well. Do you want to?
Yes, it's very much another older listener coming in with another question that's probably self-interest. So regarding the use of semantic context by older listeners, you mentioned older listeners may have more practice using semantic context to compensate for misheard words. Can you elaborate on how this practice develops over time? And I guess more specifically, whether it's something that can be explicitly taught or learnt?
Yeah. So thank you. So basically, this develops over. So this is basically here a plot of how different cognitive functions develop over age, and basically you could see that a lot of stuff gets worse, and basically what tends to improve is things like vocabulary test, synonyms, basically knowledge about the world. And I think it's just when you're an old listener and automatically and more about this tends to be the context, and even though you've only heard half of it, you can probably take educated guesses. B, over time, you've done this more, so you have more experience in taking educated guesses. And it's also like based on, as I said, more about it. So it's it develops over time, and you can actually show that quite well in when you're using sort of speech and noise test where the sentences like are high and low context sentences. And there's a really sort of famous paper by Kathy Pecora Fuller from 95 that shows that the difference between intelligibility in high and low context sentences is way bigger for older adults than young adults, because older adults are much more successful in taking educated guesses. So they haven't heard, they haven't heard more than the young people, but they're more likely to take the correct guess. And that is something that just develops over age. But again, I would say that does come at a cost, because it's quite, it's quite an energy intensive, it's like, it's a really good strategy, no question, but you have to spend quite a bit of energy on it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's very, very helpful. I just want to get to that specific point, though, because I think this could have wider implications. Is it something that could be explicitly taught or learned?
Yes, exactly. Like, I mean, you're absolutely right. And I keep coming back to that as well, because I really want to know, like, again, can we work out what are good listening strategies, and can we help people train that if we know that this is a good strategy? And if you're not currently using it, maybe as an older listener, even though we know you have good vocabulary, for instance, is there like anything we can do to, encourage you to use that because it's a good strategy? And I don't think anybody has done any of that at all, but I agree. I think definitely worth a try.
Yeah, I think there's something in that. I think it's an important implication of your work.
I agree.
Thank you very much. I know that we've gone on a bit long, but it's been fascinating. Thank you very much.
Well, I have one more question. Go on.
So a lot of what you've been speaking about today relates to speech intelligibility and speaking normally. Does it translate across into song, lyric intelligibility? I'm very interested in music and people with hearing difference, hearing loss. So does the same sort of processing,
maybe
cues and what have you, work in that context?
I don't know. I would think so, because particularly with lyrics, that's also about comprehension and understanding.
So you get a lot of people that sort of think that the lyric of the song is something,
yes,
and will be singing along merrily, and actually
there's something completely, exactly. I mean, the main difference sort of with speaking and music obviously is that the pitch cues are completely different, and so I don't know anything about pitch cues in singing, but I would expect that some of these things translate. And maybe, it's only some listening strategies and not others. And maybe, listening to song has some listening strategies that are not being used in spoken speech. That would basically take somebody to do that research.
I'm just thinking, with Spotify, I can read the lyrics a lot.
Yeah.
But I don't have the visual cue. So as my hearing is deteriorating, I know now that I am relying on being able to see you. And being able to focus on you
is an entire different topic, which is the visuals, exactly, the auditory visual integration that we have not talked about. There's a whole other
there's a whole area.
But in music,
have that. Yeah,
that's true. Well, thank you very much. I think we better stop there, otherwise we can go on for hours.
It's tremendous.
Thank you. That was fun.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you. How do I leave?
It's that whole complex thing. I was thinking when you were talking about